What's up? Hey guys, how's it going? You guys awake? Okay, good. Okay. So, wow. So, I'm back, and I did some more doodles, and we're going to go right into it because we got some ground to cover. So, you guys ready? Are you ready? All right, let's do it. You can play the first video, Arden. Review. So we're just going to look at the gospel timeline. This is God's big picture plan. So if you open up your Bible, those 7 points, it's not like they're listed like point 1, a chapter of the Bible, but these are 7 main themes of the story of the Scriptures. And so, this is why we're going through them. We kind of went through creation. You guys went through creation, went through curse. Last week we started the covenant. So we're going to continue that tonight. And then also next week, we're going to do another element of the covenant. So next week, you don't want to miss that. We're going to look at the covenant with David, which has a lot to do with, actually, you'll be surprised, it actually has a lot to do with Christmas. Ooh, it'll be a Christmas-themed covenant one. If you look right under review, if you tell somebody, what's the big picture story, or what's the big picture message of the Bible? Something that is so simple that you could tell to a 5-year-old. And they could understand it. And I like how one person put it, it said, he's going to fix the earth like it was in the beginning. And so it's simple, but it's how that's all going to happen has layers and depth to it. But the storyline is something that we can all follow, from creation to the curse, to the covenants, to the cross, church, crisis, the cure, God's big picture plan. You can go to the next slide. So the problem, sin and rebellion, and this is no light matter. If you guys remember from Genesis, the wages of sin is death. It's returning to the dust. But God has a plan. The story of the Scriptures tell of His master plan to fix what went wrong. And so this is what we're following. We're tracing the footsteps back to the beginning and following it through. And guys, you want to know why this is important? Because, sometimes you're talking about like Abraham and Israel, and it's like, okay, this feels like just a nice story. These feel like Christianity 101 or something. The reason this is so important is because this story tells of redemption and restoration and salvation, deliverance, hope, joy. Kingdom is, and the longing, even it says in Romans 8 that the creation is longing and it's groaning for this plan. And so we're going into it, guys. We're digging in. So I encourage you, if it feels like dull to you or not interesting, to just lean your ear in and even pay attention to how these things are unfolding in the big picture story, because we're not going to cover all of the story of the Bible in one, session, one meeting, but that's what we're taking, and it's building each one from creation. It's building to the curse, to the covenants. Okay, you can go to the next one. So God's promise and His plan, or His promise plan, is bound. It's inseparable. It's intrinsically woven. It is chained and linked, and you can't pull them apart. To Abraham and his seed. His seed is, was Isaac. That's his son, his descendant. It's Jacob, but then it's also a promised seed. There's one that's going to come from Eve, who's going to crush the serpent's head. Anyway, so Abraham's saying, all together now, do you remember? The land, the seed, the blessing. I heard you guys kind of talking about it in your small groups, about the blessing, the reversal of the curse, curse of Genesis, going into the ground, to dust you will return, the resurrection, coming back out in glorified bodies. It's pretty awesome. You can go to the next one. This promise and this plan is going to go from the Creator. It's a promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. So this is in history. This is his. So Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, Abraham was his grandpa. He's a grandpa. Grandpa was promised this, and it's passed down to me. My dad was Isaac. Now to Israel, so he's got the promise now because it's coming through his line, and then Israel becomes Israel. So, and the crazy thing is this word covenant. Remember we talked about that last week. It's kind of one of those Sunday school answer things you just hear you hear in the Bible, and you're like, okay, it's just a Bible word. But covenant is a word. It's that sacred agreement, and I put the little Hebrew word. It comes from a word that means to cut. Because what they would do when they would have a covenant, it's kind of gruesome. You ready for this? They would kill an animal and put half of the animal on one side. I see some people like, ugh. And then half on the other side. And then you have to, hold hands and walk through it or something. I'm not exactly sure how they did it, but you have to go through it. And what you're saying is, may God do this to me if I don't keep my part of this covenant. And so it's like this. It's this big, weighty commitment. And so God is saying this, he's making this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel. You can go to the next one. Did you get that bound by covenant if you're following in the notes? Okay. Ooh, it's up right there. Okay. You can go to the next one, next slide. So the covenant with Israel. And so Israel, if you guys remember the story, I'll give you a little refresher here. We're going to move kind of fast through it, but I think some of you might be familiar with the story. So Abraham was given these promises. Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. One of his sons was a guy named Joseph. Anybody remember Joseph? He was sold into slavery into Egypt by his brothers. Big famine came on the land. All his brothers who, betrayed him actually ended up coming to Egypt. They all moved to Egypt. Jacob moved to Egypt. And so all of a sudden, Israel is in Egypt. They become this great multitude, like stars in the sky or sand on the seashore. So remember, that was one of the things that was promised to Abraham, is that his descendants would be like stars in the sky and sand on the seashore. And so, and if you remember the story too, the Egyptians started to not be so friendly to Israel, and they actually became oppressors, and the Israelites were enslaved. God calls them out of Egypt into the desert land. I mean, we're skipping some major, events that happen, like the plagues and the parting of the water, going out into the wilderness. Well, because what you got to see is the bigger picture, because those are the things we might see in the Sunday school books we open. And it's like, oh, we're going through the Red Sea, and everyone's happy except for the guys who the water's closing back in on. But so what I want to point out is that the reason God is doing this is he's calling this multitude of people out into the wilderness to follow him, because his plan is that he's going to call them to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. That's Exodus 19:6. God called Israel to be holy, a holy nation, and they're set apart as a kingdom of priests. And so holy is another one of those words that is like a Sunday school word, like holy. We kind of think of it like holier than thou, like, oh. But holy is one of those words that means set apart. It means there's things that are like for common uses, and then there's things that are for special uses. Like, does anybody have parents who bring out special plates or silverware or something? Well, Israel was going to be the special plates or silver. I don't know. They're going to be the special nation to God, not just so he can bring them out on special occasions when his friends come around or something, but the fact that they are going to represent him. They have a unique and individual, unique calling, and that's not like the rest of the nations. And one of the main parts about this is that they are to be set apart to him alone, to God alone, that they're not supposed to go after all these other, gods of the different nations that other people were following, that they were to be his alone. And that he had this plan that they were going to be the ones who this promised seed, and this promised land, and this promised blessing are all going to come through as a land, as a people, as a national identity. And we're talking million people, I don't know, a lot of people, and they have this promise and this commitment. And the one thing I want to point out too is the kingdom of priests. Priests minister to God and to people. So priests' role is to minister to God and worship, and then also to minister to people. And so Israel's role as a people group was to minister to God and worship him alone, and then also to minister to the other people. But if they're all priests, who are they ministering to? You know what I mean? If they're a kingdom of priests, do they minister to each other? Maybe. But their role was to be ministering to the other nations and blessing the other nation and instructing. And that's God's way, because remember, to Abraham, he was going to bless him, and he was going to make him a blessing to all the nations. So this promised blessing is going to come now through Israel to the nations. Pretty cool. Next slide. So they were given some specific things. We're covering a lot of ground here, so we got to hang in there. They were given the law and the temple and the promises. The law is a holy guideline for living as God's chosen people. They were to be different from the other nations. They had this way that kept them to remind them that they're going to be inheriting something far greater than the things that this world has to offer. And so they were to live in a certain way that corresponded with that identity. And they were the temple was a certain way of worship that God chose. He did, and different gods that different nations served. They did all kinds of ways that they were worshipped. Some are really nasty, and God was holy, and because God's the creator, he's the God of all gods. He is the one who made all things, and so he's not like these other gods. And so he had a certain way he wanted to be worshipped. The promises, the glorious inheritance of God's restored creation. Glory. Okay, you can go to the next one. So Israel, they have this unique calling, this distinct identity, and they have this way, this calling. They're called to live a certain way. We're talking now not just one person. We're talking about an entire nation of people. Is this real? This is real. Oh, that was pretty funny. Okay, you can go to the next one. Why Israel? Why would God choose Israel? Why not Germany? Why not China? Why not fill in the blank? What? Russia? So why would he choose just one people? And because actually at the root of this, there's something kind of offensive that we're not really saying. Because what we're not saying, or what we are saying, is that God chose one people. That means he didn't choose other people. And so this seems like it's getting at something, and it's meant to. I put this quote that I really like. Oh, can you go back to that one? I put this quote on there. It's kind of tiny when I look at the very fact of election. An election, you guys know what an election is. Like you choose somebody. God choosing one nation instead of the other. It strikes directly at the heart of humanity's pride, envy, malice, and self-righteousness, because through it God shouts, I am sovereign. You are not. I am in charge, and you are not. I know what is best, and you don't. Israel's existence and calling as a nation is a statement of who actually controls the universe. Because the reality is that right now in this room, like maybe we could say, yeah, well, we know who controls the universe. But in history and up into the present day, there's many different roads and many different religions and many different people groups and cultures and so they're all, and they all say we're the best, or they all, at the heart of it, it says, this idea is that our way is right, and so God has chosen one way, one people, and He's done it in such a way that it gets at the heart of it, and we have to reckon with that and trust Him in His goodness. I mean, because really the fact that we're here as non-Jewish people is a part of the big story of the Bible. And so this is what we're going through, the big picture story of the Bible. And so the God of all creation has committed Himself to one particular people in a very unique way. God of Israel is the most used name in the Bible. God uses different ways to say, I'm the God of healing, I'm the God of provision. But the most, by far, the way He identifies Himself is, I'm the God of Israel. It's like if you want to know what the maker and the creator of and the author of history and of the Bible, of the story of creation, what He's like, look at the story of Israel. Okay? So because this is important. So you can go to the next slide. It is a high calling. There's blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. Little emojis. Okay. I wish we could do this here, guys. I wish we could just go into Deuteronomy 28 through 32 and just read it. If you get a chance, next week, if somebody comes up and says, I read through Deuteronomy 28 and 32, I'm going to give them a big high five. And because Deuteronomy 28 through 32 is, really all of Deuteronomy, but this is the story this is this part of the Bible where Moses is they're about to go into this promised land. Think about what that would have been like in their minds after having all this storyline of, they've heard, I heard about your great granddaddy Abraham, what he was promised, and Isaac and Jacob and Israel, and they're at the edge of the promised land, and they're like, oh man, this is it. And Deuteronomy, Moses gives this big picture big picture recounting. That's what Deuteronomy means, remembering, and they're remembering the story. And so what happens in Deuteronomy 28 to 32 particularly is that God gives them these, he lays out these blessings. It's things like, if you follow me, if you obey me, if you do what I say, there's blessings. There's things that are going to happen to you as a people that are you're going to have abundance, and you're going to be on top, and you're going to prosper. And then there, on the other side, if you don't listen to me and you don't obey me, there's going to be curses. And these are painful. These are like sobering. Like, this isn't like funny. Like, this is actually deeply painful throughout history. We could talk about very real things that have happened throughout history. And there are things like other nations, you're going to be thrown out of the promised land, and other nations are going to come and oppress you. And it's going to, there's basically going to be a lot of pain in store for disobeying God. And what you see throughout history is that Israel goes through these cycles where they disobey God. And one of the big things is they go after other gods. And they bring upon themselves these curses. And so what happens is that it forms this backdrop of the story. Okay, this big picture story. Remember, we're talking about a big story here. And so this is how this promised blessing and how these curses and how God's promised blessing is going to come through a people. But there's a problem. The people are disobeying, and the people aren't keeping their part of the covenant. But they're the way that He's appointed, and He's committed. Like God, He's the God of Israel. He's going to use Israel to do this promise and this blessing that we've been going over and over and over. That He's going to come through Israel. But do you see the dilemma and the crisis? Okay, look at this verse in Romans 11. Now, if they're stumbling, it's talking about Israel. Romans 11, also another awesome chapter to go through to help understand Israel in the Bible. If their stumbling brings riches for the world and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full number bring? Okay, let me explain what that means. So they're stumbling, meaning them not keeping their part of the covenant, where they actually, what's called a partial hardening came over all of Israel. They rejected the Messiah largely. When Jesus came, a lot of the Jewish people did not follow Him, although a lot of people did. But it basically, through that, God allowed blessings to come through to the Gentiles. Now, Gentiles just means people who aren't Jewish. It's a Jewish word, or it's a way of saying people who are non-Jews, like me, like I'm sure pretty much all of us. Like, so this is good news. So, but through their failure that happened. So he's saying how much more? Because this whole part of Romans is this. Because we're here now 2,000 years after Jesus came, and a lot of Jewish people may not really want anything to do with Jesus, and so now salvation has come to the non-Jews. And guys, you know what's crazy is that all of this was promised and prophesied about in Deuteronomy 32. But when you go through and read it all, you'll see what I mean, if you do that. But so, now salvation has come to the Gentiles. But how much more? How much more will the full number of Jewish people coming back to Jesus be? It will be life from the dead. That's what it says in Romans 11. That's not my word. That's His words. So let's back up. So all this is, what I'm saying here is that God has a plan to use a certain people, Israel, to bless all the nations. And Israel was unfaithful. God's still faithful. He's still committed, and He still has a plan. And so we're a part of this big story. So when we look at God's big picture plan, He's committed to this people to the end. And so that's where we find ourselves into this big story. And one of the things, if you look in the back of that picture, that's an olive tree. It's a really cool looking tree. It's all gnarly and got all these crazy looking branches. Makes me want to climb in it. But so what that olive tree picture is it's a picture referred to, or Israel is referred to as an olive tree in the Bible. And the olive tree, it says that certain branches were broken off. Certain branches were chopped off. And other branches wild branches were grafted in, and so they're growing into this olive tree. Do you know what that's a picture of? It's a picture of non-Jewish people being brought into the Jewish storyline, the Jewish salvation hope of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, this, what we've been talking about, the covenant, and these non-Jewish people being brought into this, and we're like, we used to be these, you know, raggedy old weed bushes, and we're like into this like awesome olive tree, and so that's a picture of like how we relate to Israel. Does that make sense? I know we kind of talked a lot, but I want to just open up. Does anybody have any questions or response? Totally. Yeah, totally. Because Israel, the whole, you know, if you remember all the way back to the Tower of Babel and all these different nations, and they get scattered, and you know, and they go their own way. Well, God, what does He do? Does He pick one of them? No, He just picks this random guy and is like, I'm going to make your name great. Because that was the whole thing of Babel. They were saying, let's make our name great. We want to be, you know, build our tower to heaven and have this great name. And God goes to Abraham, this like, guy's like, oh, who, me? You know, and so there's not much to boast in. You know, it was just God's choice. And that's the part that God's choice plays, is that it eliminates this thing inside of human beings that says, I did that. I achieved that. I merited that. And He's like, I chose you. You know, it's like, that's like because of my grace. And that's a big part of God's story, God's grace and choosing Israel. But that's a good point. Okay, I'm going to pray, and then we will be done. All right, Lord, I just thank you. Oh, I thank you for your faithfulness to your promise to Israel throughout history. From beginning to the end, it just shows us that you are a covenant-keeping God, that you don't play around. That when we fail and we go our own way, you're faithful. You remember. You're the God who remembers the covenant. You remember your people. You remember your promise. You remember us. When we turn to you, you remember that in our lives, just like you remember when Israel turns to you. Lord, I pray that you would help us understand, help us see. Lord, we pray that you would bring many Jewish people to know their Messiah. Lord, we just long for the day when the full number of Jewish people come in and that results in life from the dead. Amen.